on this. Okay, so let me. Okay,
Okay, are we all ready to go?
I believe we are.
Okay, it is a pleasure to introduce our speaker, Amy Crider. Her first novel, Disorder, was just published to just outstanding reviews, and we've already heard a couple of outstanding reviews from our members who've read it. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is the long journey between first draft and published. She is a playwright whose work has been seen around the country. She won the Tennessee Williams one-act play contest, has degrees in theater and education, and she and her husband live in Chicago. So welcome, Amy.
Oh, thank you. I just saw something in the chat, so I got distracted. Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate you're taking the time to have me.
Well, we appreciate the fact that you would be willing to join us. Let's just start. I gave you a short introduction, but can you give us a little bit of background about yourself and your writing?
Well, I'm 60 years old, and I was raised mostly in upstate New York, which is where the book takes place. I moved to Chicago around 2001. And I've been writing since I was a child. I became interested in writing from early childhood. I grew up in a house full of Agatha Christie novels, and as a child was really entertained by the Happy Hollisters, which is a children's book series from the 60s where this family of children solve mysteries. So there was always this element of enjoying mysteries from my earliest childhood, and I wanted to write something like a Happy Hollister's book, even at the age of 8, but I was always more ambitious than I was disciplined, because when I started this novel, a novel when I was 8, but I only wrote like 2 pages, and then I just gave up because I didn't have a plot. So I was always interested in writing from that early time. And my sister, Joan, is a poet. And so we sort of, I think, encouraged each other too in writing from childhood.
Okay. So your interest in writing goes a long way back?
Yeah.
What was your first effort to, because you've written plays and had them produced and won contests, when did you start down that path instead of the path of writing mysteries or novels?
Well, I actually was working on novels before I went into plays. I started Disorder around 2001 and wrote a few novels that I was trying to sell. And it was actually a little bit later that I went into playwriting. I started taking playwriting classes. I took some comedy writing classes at Second City, and then really serious playwriting starting around 2010 at a place called Chicago Dramatists. And so when I went into playwriting, I started to focus more and more on that, because I found until this most recent draft of Disorder, I found I was much better at writing plays than novels. I felt more comfortable writing plays. Fiction was something I had really struggled with. I felt like I wasn't good at describing things, and in plays you don't have to describe things, you just have the dialogue and the action. So I focused on plays and continue to focus on plays ever since about 2010. But I was still all along trying to sell Disorder. I was trying to sell another novel as well, but I was really focused on trying to sell Disorder as I was developing my playwriting career.
So was Disorder the first novel you attempted?
Yeah, pretty much. I tried to write some things in high school, but Disorder was the first one. Yeah, it was the first serious novel I sat down to write.
Okay, so let's start a little closer to the end, and then we'll move back. But how long did it take you to get Disorder published, from the time you sat down and started writing to the time that it actually got published?
Well, it was really about 20 years. I started the first draft, and I wish I could remember because I no longer have the very first draft. I, for some reason, deleted that file, so I can't go back and check. But I think I started it around 2001 or 2002. I know I finished the first draft in 2003, and that was when I started querying agents. It won the contest that with the prize of publication at the end of 2020. And then there was a few months before I actually started working with the editor. So, and it came out at the end of 2021. So, it was,
now,
yeah,
go ahead.
Roughly 20 years.
So let's go back to the beginning. What was the inspiration for the novel?
Well, this is something that, it's funny, this hasn't been publicized as much as I expected it to be, but it was based on my own experience being bipolar. When I was a young woman, around in my late 20s to about 30-ish, I developed bipolar disorder. That's a very typical age to develop the symptoms. And I had very terrible bouts of paranoid mania for a little while. But I was lucid much of the time too. It's not like I was crazy all the time. I would just have these periods of mania that became increasingly paranoid and nightmarish. And I found myself thinking, oh, it's a good thing I'm not involved in a murder investigation right now, because I'd really be in trouble. And I was kind of surrounded by some peculiar people at the time as well that also inspired some of my thinking. But I knew I wanted to write that someday, because I thought, what a great idea for a novel, how commercial that would be. And so that was my inspiration. In 1994, I was put on an amazingly effective medication called risperidone that practically cured me. I can't say I've been 100% symptom free all these years, but I've been very close to symptom free, excuse me, since I was put on this medication in 1994. So I'm very lucky, and I know that's very unusual to have such a positive experience with medication. I had been put on lithium before that, and lithium had no effect on my symptoms, and that's usually the first medication they try. As a matter of fact, I was put on risperidone before it was approved for bipolar disorder, but it was approved a couple of years later as a treatment. So that was my inspiration. And then it was a few years as my life took twists and turns before I finally sat down to actually write the novel. So that was my inspiration. So I did base a lot of her symptoms and her experiences pretty closely on things I really, and her therapy, and the incompetence of some of her therapy, pretty closely on things I actually experienced.
So as you were, describe this process. How long did it take you to write that first draft? Was it, did you outline? Did you just sit down with a notepad and write? How did you accomplish the first draft, and how long did it take?
I tend to be an outliner in general, and it's been so long, I wish I could remember better, but it was probably a year-ish that I spent on the first draft. I started off, I was working a job that I quit in February of 2002 with the support of my husband, excuse me, so that I could write. So I probably started really working on it around February of 2002. And so I'd say like a year on the first draft. But and all along, as it was rejected by agents, I continued to revise it over the years. Right.
Well,
through
there's
publication.
an old saying that a friend of mine, Matthew Clemens, uses when he teaches classes. He says, the first draft doesn't have to be good, it just has to be done. So how good was that first draft? How good did you think it was at the time? And looking back on it, how good do you think it really was?
It was terrible. I was not a good writer of fiction when I started this novel, and I'm the first to admit that. And one thing, there was a time early on when one agent was a little bit interested in it, and it ended up not working out with him. But he gave me some feedback about, for example, adverbs and how much I was using adverbs in that version, where he said quietly, she said consolingly, like every dialogue tag had an adverb, and it was really not very good at all. And I struggled for a while, and because I knew it wasn't that good, but I didn't know what to do to make it better. I was in this limbo, this in-between state of knowing it wasn't good enough, but not knowing the next step, how to improve it, how to make it better. I was in some informal workshops with people a few times, and I did get some tips on writing style in those workshops that helped. But I really struggled for a long time.
I noticed that, Elizabeth is going to be monitoring the questions in the chat, but there was one that popped up from Janet Williams that just fits in right with what we're talking about. She says, I'd like to hear about the critique process. How often did you share the novel, and what changes were made as a result of the critiques in the plot and the character development? And I'll add, she didn't ask this, but I'll add, and in your writing style.
That's a good question. I did get critiques from people. I can't say that these critiques really made a big impact on the writing. The feedback I got from some of the people I shared it with was very general, and just general reactions, and they were very varied. I had one friend, it's sad, she passed away a couple of years ago, and so she never got to see the final version, and she hated it. She said, oh, this is so depressing, what a depressing book, I can't stand it. So I got that feedback from one friend. But I can't say that the critiques I got made that big of an impact on the book. I just kept plugging away at it.
So what were the major types of changes that you were making during this? Because you said you continued to revise this for most of that 20 years, right?
Yeah, I was moving chapters around, coming up with new material, trying out different things. At one point, there was a second murder, which I then took back out of the book. Actually, right now, I would say there's almost nothing in the current version of the book that was in the first draft. Almost nothing. But I can tell you what.
Go ahead.
I can tell you what the biggest turning point was, if that's not jumping ahead.
No.
Okay, so what happened was, late in the process, around maybe 2018, I got feedback from an agent. Most of the time I did not get feedback from agents. Sometimes they would say the voice wasn't strong enough. That was the most common criticism I got. It was just, it had a weak voice. And then in 2018, an agent rejected it, saying that she didn't like that it had an unreliable narrator. And that kind of bothered me a little, because I never felt that Wendy was particularly unreliable. I felt like she was pretty reliable, even though she was mentally ill and bipolar. So it just hit me to change the whole thing from third person to first person, and to have the opening line, "I am not an unreliable narrator." And when I did that, when I made that change from third person to first person, that was the change that sold the book, that found the voice, that made it better writing, that improved the whole writing of the book enormously, to find that voice in first person. And so I realized from now on, as I continue to write novels, I'm mostly going to stick with first person, because I just find it easier. And I don't know if it goes to playwriting, because it's like you're writing a monologue at that point. I'm not sure what it is, but that was the key that changed the book, that made it good enough to get it published.
Did you, when you're writing in third person, I'm throwing this out, and you may feel free to totally disagree with this, but it sounds like, I could see that writing in third person would keep it keeps a bit of a barrier between you and your characters, because you're even close third person, you're sort of the observer, whereas you're writing in first person, you're the participant. Did you look at it that way? Were you able to put more of yourself into that protagonist by writing in first person?
I would say the first thing you said is what I agree with, that there's more of a barrier. And I actually felt more distant from her in first person, because now I was assuming this other character, this other person, and she does not express herself the way I do. I think I felt a little more distance from her. And I know that doesn't sound like it makes much sense, but I felt more distant from her finding her voice in first person. And I think I was more direct and more assertive in telling the story, more so than I would be in my real life. I made her this very assertive character who is very direct and saying, I am not an unreliable narrator, and this and that and the other. I found a very assertive voice in her that is probably not even that much like myself.
Amy, can I just say something? This is Elizabeth.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to
remember-
ask you if we had any questions in the
Well,
chat, or any
we have
questions
one,
you
but
have.
this. So I've known Amy for a really, really long time, and I remember when you got that comment from that agent, and you were ticked. And I'm wondering if that actually had more to do with it, to say like she is not an unreliable narrator, and then that's actually like the assertiveness maybe came from there, because I remember you were not happy when you got the comments.
I don't remember that I even wrote you about it, but yeah, I was pretty ticked. Yeah. I think that was what sparked this voice that was going to be very assertive and say, no, I'm not. And it's not that I took it personally. I didn't feel like she was calling me unreliable, but I just felt like this character that meant so much to me. No, she's not that unreliable.
Well, I think it was more that you felt that they were completely misunderstanding the character.
Yeah.
And so you were like, okay, I'm gonna change this.
Yeah.
Okay, and actually we do have like one comment.
Okay.
Bridget asked, she would love to hear some comments on working with the audiobook and how that has performed for her.
I'm sorry to say this, but I actually had nothing to do with the audiobook, and I still haven't listened to the sample that I could listen to. I've heard it's a fantastic performance. I know she's an OB award-winning actress, but that was all handled by Recorded Books. It was my publisher who sold the audio rights to Recorded Books, so I wasn't even a part of the sale. I actually had no relationship with the production of the audiobook.
So let's talk about we haven't touched on this topic, but without giving it away, you want to sell the book to everybody out here, but tell us a little bit about, there it is. Tell us about it. Tell us what the gist of what the story is about.
Well, this graduate student who's around 30 years old, is struggling with bipolar disorder. She had been on disability and come off disability to go back to school. She'd been trained to be a high school teacher and decided she'd been out of work for a while, having been on disability. So she's gone back to school to get a master's degree to sort of beef up her credentials to find work again. But she's very, even though I talk about her being assertive, she's also very unsure of herself. It kind of is a yin and yang thing. So she doesn't have a lot of confidence in herself. One of the things I should say is that this idea of her being assertive but not sure of herself, there's kind of a double narration because she's telling the story years later. So her older voice, as an older woman now telling the story, is assertive and saying, I'm not an unreliable narrator. But
was that the way the book was conceived?
No,
was
this
an
was
older person looking back?
This was only in the most recent version. And so the older character is assertive and sure of herself. The younger character that she's talking about is very unsure of herself and not confident. So she's recalling her time when she was younger and vulnerable and not sure of herself. And one of the reasons I did this sort of dual narration was that I spent so many years working on this book that I had to explain why there's no Facebook, why there are no smartphones in this book, because I started it long before there was social media and all of that. And I didn't want to put that into the book. I didn't want to introduce social media, smartphones. So I thought, well, maybe this story took place long enough ago that those things weren't there. And she's telling the story about the past. So I did that to cover the fact that it doesn't take place in the completely modern world. So the story takes place in 2007. And at the end of the book, you find that she's writing it in 2013. And so she's telling the story a few years later. So that's a little complicated, and people sometimes miss that while they're reading it, but it's not really that important whether you get that while you're reading it. So she's in this graduate school, and she's in this small state university in upstate New York, in this very isolated rural area, which are based on where I had lived for many years. The specific towns I was inspired by were Delhi, where there's a tiny state university, and this town has like one traffic light, if I remember correctly. It's like tiny. And Oneonta, where I had taken classes for a while. So these small, rural, upstate New York towns, very isolated, which to me has kind of a Gothic feel to it. And she's working with two university professors, Dr. Kind and Dr. Hellman, who behave strangely towards her. And it's hard to say, is she being paranoid, or is there something not quite right about these people? And her roommate disappears early in the book. She's sharing a house with a woman named Diana. And so she's investigating what happened to her roommate. And she's also struggling with a certain amount of guilt, because as her roommate has disappeared and is found dead, I mean, that's probably not a spoiler because you can assume that. She's struggling with guilt about why didn't she know her roommate better? Why was her roommate such a mystery to her that she wouldn't know possible secrets about her? Why didn't she confide in her? So that's some of the emotion going on in the story. And so that's the setup of the mystery.
So any idea, did you ever count, did you keep a chart, how many query letters you sent out over the years?
I didn't.
How many rejections you received?
I didn't keep a chart. I did check my, I do keep track on my Outlook calendar, and I did a search under the title disorder to see how many emails I sent out over the years. And I had even from the days before I was doing Outlook, I had once counted up all the rejections. And I would say I got about 100 rejections from agents. It probably at least 100. I rarely got feedback. There were a handful of agents who did request the full manuscript over the years. And one agent who was even willing to read it twice, who asked me to revise it and read it a second time and still rejected it. And most of these rejections were because it didn't have a strong voice until I made that change to first person. But what surprised me the most is that most of the agents who rejected it on the basis of the premise, that they weren't interested in a murder mystery about a bipolar woman solving her roommate's murder. And that surprised me over and over, because I always thought this was such a commercial idea. And everyone I talked to about it over the years said, wow, that's fantastic. I would love to read a book like that. And yet these agents were not interested in that story, regardless of the writing style. So yeah, I would say at least 100 agents rejected. And the wonderful thing is I sold it without an agent ultimately. So so there.
Okay, well, I want to get to that in a minute, but when I heard your story and we talked, the one thing that really stands out with me in your story is, how do you persist? How do you, there's that line from a couple of years ago, the political line in a different context, where a certain senator said about a certain person in the other party, she persisted. And that sounds like you. If I could, the story you tell, if you were to do an autobiography of yourself and your experience with this, I would suggest the title, She Persisted. How, after rejection, after 18 years before you, or 16 years, whatever the number is, before you switch to first person narrative, how do you continue to work on this? How do you continue to have faith in that project and your own abilities and this story to continue and not just throw it in the trash can and go out and write another play?
I never felt I had a choice. I never felt like I had the choice to give up on this. You know, I quit my last full-time job in 2002. I've had a couple little part-time jobs over the years since then. My husband was supporting me. I did inherit a little money, so I wasn't entirely being supported by my husband. But I felt I owed it to him to pull my weight, you know, to make some money at my writing. And I felt I had to sell a novel and kind of earn my keep. And the thing is too, is that I always believed in the commercial aspect of this novel. I mean, that might be a terrible thing to say, but I always thought this was a really commercial idea. And I wasn't even thinking of it as like my great work of art, because for me, my plays in a way are my great work of art. I just felt like someone's got to buy this book because it's a natural, it's something that people would really be interested in. And I never gave up believing that there was a market for this book. And I never felt like I had the choice. I just had to sell something. I did write a couple of other novels I also couldn't sell. But I always came back to this because I knew this was an interesting story. I knew there was an audience for this story, and I don't think I ever would have given up. And I did get some advice from my sister, who's an English professor. And at one point she said, you know, sometimes your first novel that's a little autobiographical is something that you can't sell and that you shouldn't try to sell, just put it away. And she was sort of encouraging me to, at one point, to maybe give up on this idea. And I did set it
Did-
aside. There were periods of time when I set it aside. I didn't work on it continuously at all. It's not like I was writing it every day for 20 years. I spent long periods of time not working on it, not querying agents. But I always came back to it because I thought it was a great idea for a story that people would be intrigued by. And I just couldn't give up on it.
Did you give your sister the first copy of the book?
She bought a copy. She said she would buy it. She didn't even ask me to mail her one of my author copies. I had a lot of people to give copies to, so I was grateful that she said she would just buy her own copy.
So you mentioned commercial, and I'm not asking you for figures or dollars or anything, but how has the commercial success of the book been for you
Well,
compared to your expectations?
That's the ironic thing, is that I did not actually make a lot of money. I mean, I made I can't sneeze at it. It was real money, but it was not six figures. It was not The Girl on the Train. It was not like a big commercial thing after all those years. It was not a huge amount of money, but at least I got it sold, and I proved to the world that I could get this book published. I got the sales figures in March, and it came out in December. It was delayed. The official publication date was like November 9th, but it was actually delayed into December. So I got a sales report in March. They'll send me one once a year, every March. And between coming out in December and the March report, it had sold 214 copies. The initial print run is 1,900 copies. According to my editor, it only sold about 3 audio copies, which is strange because I know more than 3 people who said they bought the audio version. And only about 8 of the Kindle versions, which really surprised me because I thought everyone would be interested in Kindle. So hopefully,
I gotta say, I tried to order the Kindle version and I could not find it on Amazon, but somebody in our group suggested a way that I could find it, that it was there, but it was not in the normal click on the book and there's the Kindle and there's the hardcover and there's the Audible book.
I wonder if that was just a temporary glitch, because I've always seen it there when I've looked it up.
You mentioned you didn't use an agent when you eventually sold it. So tell us about how that happened, how the book got sold.
It won a contest. So what happened was I had entered it in 2 contests. So I didn't query a lot of agents even after I made that enormous change, because I thought I would enter it in these contests. So first I entered it in the Minotaur Books contest. I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. It's for a first mystery novel. And I waited several months to get that rejection. And then right after that, I entered it in the University of New Orleans Press Lab Prize, which is a novel writing contest, and waited a bit for that and got word that it was a finalist. It was one of 17 finalists. I forget when I found out it was a finalist, probably early fall of 2020. And then the week before Thanksgiving of 2020, they wrote and said that I was the winner of the contest. And the prize was publication and an advance.
Well, congratulations. So hang on, I lost my place in my outline. Did you work with an editor? And how was that experience?
It was a very good experience, and I worked quite a bit. There was the managing editor, was the one I dealt with for the business stuff and PR, and then there was a young woman who was their editor. And I could mention, so this prize was actually awarded by their MFA students. Their MFA class runs their publishing company at the University of New Orleans Press. And I was very surprised and very happy that these young people were so interested in this book. And so the editor I worked with was a recent MFA graduate, and her name is Chelsea. And she was very helpful. The biggest change that I made through the editing process was just that I added a lot of material. I tend to be kind of a brief, skimpy writer. I tend to underwrite rather than overwrite. So there was a lot of new material, scenes that were not developed enough. The ending was not quite developed enough. I probably added, I think, about 7,000 words in that editing process. And she was great. And she also made some good little cultural suggestions. You know, since I have it set in 2007, I'm not that aware of changing cultural landscape. And so she made suggestions like a character was wearing an Ed Hardy t-shirt at one point. And I vaguely know what an Ed Hardy t-shirt looks like, but I wasn't thinking of that in terms of 2007, you know, and there's a reference to Michael Bublé and, you know, some little cultural references like that that she suggested. But she was great and we had a great working relationship. Yeah, so that was an interesting process. And there's a lot that can happen with working with an editor. It's not done just because it's been accepted by a publisher.
So I'm always interested in titles because I've heard the stories. I've heard John Gilstrap talk about his titles and the fact that he had never had all of his books. He had never had one with the published with the title he gave it. On the other hand, Lori Rader Day has every one of her books has been the title she gave her book from the outset. So how about Disorder? Is that the title you gave it? Is that what it was named from the start? Did the title change as you went through the process?
This is kind of weird. It's not something I mention very often, but it was Disorder from fairly early on, but it was not the first title. And the reason was because I started this so long ago that I wasn't exactly sure what my most accurate diagnosis was, because there was a period of time when I wondered if I was a misdiagnosed schizophrenic, because my manic episodes bordered on schizophrenic symptoms. And I had a psychiatrist at one point who I felt was hinting that maybe he thought I was misdiagnosed, but he was someone I only saw very briefly, and I never found out if he thought that for sure. So the first title was actually something like A Mild Case of Schizophrenia, which is stupid. I mean, there's no such, is there such a thing as a mild case? But I didn't know because I wasn't sure exactly what I was, but not too long after that, I'm sorry, there's a siren going by. I live
It's
right
Chicago.
I live right down the street from a hospital, so I get a lot of sirens. But not too long after I started it, though, I found out that there's a diagnosis called bipolar disorder with psychotic features. And I thought, oh, well, that's an accurate depiction of what I went through. And I knew, and then I found out later that that was actually an official diagnosis I'd been given that I didn't even know about for a while. So I knew, okay, bipolar disorder, that's definitely it. So I just thought I wanted a simple, catchy title, you know, and I just thought, well, disorder, it's about someone who has a disorder. And that was fairly early on that I came up with that as the title. It turns out there's some kind of murder mystery movie with that as the same title about a schizophrenic, which is a little annoying because schizophrenia is not a mood disorder. So I wish they hadn't taken that title for their movie, but it's not a widely used title. So, and you don't copyright a title anyway. So. And I like that title. I think Disorder is a nice, simple title.
It sounds like a great title to me. I'm not an expert, but but you mentioned there's a movie out there. So if you had any hints or interest expressed in whether this might, because from the way you describe it, it strikes me as being an incredibly great vehicle for whoever's making movies these days, Netflix, HBO, whoever.
That would be nice. Since I don't have an agent, I don't really have a way of pitching it to anyone. The only thing I got was an email from someone, excuse me, someone who runs a database of books that are out there that are potential movies that potential producers can search to find your book as a potential movie idea. So it's listed on this database. I don't know if it's a popular database or commonly used by movie producers, but that's the closest I've come to getting it anywhere with making it into a movie.
So after 20 years, what did it feel like when you held that first copy in your hands?
It was nice. It was vindicating. It just felt like I knew it could make a good book. I'll show it again. It felt good. And one of the things that was interesting too, and I think maybe this was a bigger feeling than the actual getting of the physical book, was being presented with cover ideas, because they present you with possible covers while they're designing the book. So I saw there weren't a lot of ideas, about 4 different cover possibilities, and we settled on this one. I had suggested something I had always pictured for the cover that didn't work out. So that was maybe the coolest moment, was being emailed these cover designs and being asked to give my opinion on the cover.
So any more books in the works? Is there a sequel to this with the same character, or are you working on another novel, or is it back to playwriting for a while?
It's a couple of things. There won't be a sequel to this novel. I did write another murder mystery just in the last year and a half called Murder on Swan's Way, a Marcel Proust mystery, and its characters from Proust set into murder mystery. And I'm back to pitching it to agents, and I hate to say this, but back to getting rejections. But one thing is, this new novel is very short. It's only 53,000 words, which is barely longer than a novella. So I'm having a certain amount of trouble getting an agent interested in that. So you'd think, I won this contest, I got a novel published. It would be easy for me to find an agent at this point, but actually I'm back to sending out queries and getting rejections. I hate to say that, I don't want to discourage everyone, but that's right. So I'm also writing plays as well.
What response have you received from readers, if any?
I've only gotten a little bit of response. Someone that I'm acquainted with through playwriting classes wrote to me and said that she'd read it and appreciated it because her son was bipolar, and they were going through a terrible time getting his illness treated, and it really made her feel better to read my book and see someone out there talking about this, and someone who'd been successfully treated as well. So I got that feedback. Otherwise, I wondered if I was going to get emails from people, because my email address is out there on my website, and I didn't know if people reading the book would contact me, maybe tell me stories of their own illness or something, but I have not actually gotten emails like that at this point.
How about just 2 more questions, and then if anybody has any questions in our group, what was the best single piece of writing advice that you've received?
Well, this is a very tiny bit of advice, but it had to do with style. that made a big impact on how I wrote. And that was the difference between saying he was standing by the door and he stood by the door. That construction of was something is a wordy, awkward way to express the verb. And I used to do that a lot. And I got that in someone making that critique. And it really made a big influence on how I structured my sentences. The was construction and other things like that, of just honing the style so that it's more direct and more simple. That's such a tiny thing, but it was a big influence on how I wrote my prose.
And the variation on that question is, what's the single best piece of advice you could give to our group of aspiring writers?
Thank you. You know, I do have a piece of advice, and it goes back to what I said about that agent who didn't like that I had an unreliable narrator, which is, I think you have to be able to take criticism and you have to understand it and understand how to use that criticism in a way that serves your book. You're going to get a lot of different criticism from people, and it's not a question of rejecting it or accepting it at face value. It's a question of understanding how to use it, so that when I got that criticism about being an unreliable narrator, and Elizabeth pointed out I was ticked off and I could have just rejected it wholeheartedly. But what I did was I understood how to use it and adopt it and say, okay, I'm going to actually say the opposite. I am not an unreliable narrator. I'm going to use it and change the book. And I completely changed the book and made it something I could sell, because it wasn't a question of just being ticked off or accepting it entirely and saying, oh my gosh, she's right. But knowing how to use that criticism to make the book better. And so listen carefully to criticism and understand how to use it. That's my number one piece of advice.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us. Elizabeth, if we have any other questions, or if anybody has any questions, put them in the chat or speak up. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it anymore. So if anyone has any questions, please put it in the chat so that we can ask. But yeah, you okay. Had one thing though, I'd like to, you had a couple of other novels that you self-published, didn't you?
I had one that I only self-published briefly. I put it up on Amazon. This was so long ago. And it was only up for a couple of months. It was just an experiment to see if I did that, would anyone stumble upon it and buy it? And basically the answer was no. No one stumbled upon it. I didn't try to promote it.
I purchased it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. And that's one that I completely abandoned. I've never, after a few months, I never tried to sell that one. I didn't think that it was the right book to try to publish. That's one I don't even think about anymore. I've completely abandoned it. Now, another thing I could say as a piece of advice, I have this other novel. It's a historical novel about monks creating the Book of Kells in 800 AD that I also tried for a long time to try to sell and got a lot of rejection. That UNO, the publisher of Disorder, is now considering possibly publishing. They don't have plans for it, but they read it and they told me they really like it. And a piece of advice I could give is that you're not just selling yourself in your writing, or you're not just selling your writing, you're selling yourself and you're presenting yourself as someone that people would want to work with. And I've been told this in playwriting especially, that when you're trying to get a play produced, you want directors to want to work with you, you want producers to want to work with you. And the same is true with agents and publishers, that you want to be someone that they feel like, oh, I would like to work with this person. And I think the reason UNO is interested in Kells, and they are open to reading it and considering it, is because I was easy to work with. And I made my deadlines. I was always ahead of the deadlines. I didn't argue with my editor. I was someone they enjoyed working with. And I think being someone people want to work with is part of the process of selling a book or getting a play produced.
Well, thank you very much. It was a great program.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, with no more questions, and a reminder to our group about the blind pig. There was a note in the chat about that. There's a gathering, an actual in-person gathering.
It's the
For
blind
those
owl, not
interested.
the blind pig.
Blind owl. Yeah, blind pig is, different. Blind owl. So anyway, thank you very much. And I think that pretty much brings the program to a conclusion. Great job, Amy. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Amy.
Great seeing you.
Bye.